Hi, I'm Yuki Kimsing, editor of identityweek.net. Today I'm going to be speaking to Richard Bromley, who's a speaker at our upcoming event, Identity Week Europe 2026 in June. He's director in financial services at Monzo Bank. And Richard, it's really great to speak to you today because you're going to be leading an online fraud presentation at the event, which digs into some of these ideas of how we detect fraud prevention, but also what steps and precautions that customers can take to protect themselves. So, first of all, tell me a bit more about your strategies as a bank and technologies that you implement to obviously protect your customers from fraud and address these common fraud scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me on before the event. I'm very, very much looking forward to it. It's creeping ever closer, which is fantastic. Um, I think your question is a pertinent one. I think what we're observing globally is a real increase in the prevalence of fraud, which has led to many actually recognizing it now as a national security risk. Fraud is very much a technologically enabled hybrid threat. It presents an obstacle to economic growth. It can cause untold harms to individuals, to businesses. It affects societies and is often the predicate crime to fund serious and organized crime, such as, for example, terrorist financing. So, all told, I'd measure the threat landscape currently as being pretty severe as criminals increasingly use technology to automate their campaigns. And it might sound quite sobering, but I think the worst is yet to come. Um, that being said, our job, my job at Monzo, is basically to reduce this risk, is to really go at this challenge head on, utilizing our own technology to target and stop that increasingly moving target. In the UK and Europe, what we continue to see a really high rate of is authorised payment fraud. So this is where fraudsters socially engineer people into moving money into an account controlled by them. So examples you may have heard of are impersonation or investment scams. Now, rather than speak about a specific risk or a specific control, I think my mental model for addressing different fraud scenarios is really anchored on understanding the threat landscape and an ability to understand how the threat is evolving across that fraud kill chain. That allows you to be really precise in your control investment and to ensure that an orchestrated, multi-layered approach is implemented across that particular chain. So when I say the chain, it's basically the various different sequences in which fraudsters will operate to basically make that gain. And the real key to all of this is technology. So that ability to be able to take a multitude of transactional signals, behavioral signals into a machine learning model allows you to really effectively target potential fraudulent activity and target the right interventions to stop, disrupt, deter criminal activity, but also preserve that seamless customer experience, because that's the battle we're always challenged with, is how can we reduce fraud whilst at the same time managing operational costs, whilst at the same time preserving that customer experience. And that is a challenge that I know is will be very, very relevant to all fraud leaders looking at this video.
Yeah, and it is a balance between fraud prevention and fraud recovery and response. And a lot of, you're having tr contact with the customer digitally because everything is digital now. So how do you balance that investment and effort between those two things?
I've set myself up for that question with that last line, haven't I? It's a really, really good question, and I think the simple answer is, and this is definitely not me sitting on the fence whatsoever, is that each of the investments you've just mentioned actually form part of that really robust and effective fraud strategy, which is anchored in fraud detection, fraud prevention. So I think for fraud leaders, finding that effective balance between, I guess, loss reduction, customer experience, and operational cost is a continuous equation that's being calculated. That's based on both quantitative but also qualitative inputs, i.e., seen, lived, breathed experiences, maybe at different organizations or in different landscapes or different regions. But how I typically refer to this is the equation is almost a total cost of fraud model. What that basically does, it allows you to make determinations and trade-offs really quickly with the customer at the center, but thinking about what the right answer is based on answering those different parts of the equation. So if I maybe bring that to life and put that into practice, let's say fraudsters have identified a control weakness and they're currently in the process of exploiting that. The key for a financial services organization in that particular scenario is the speed at which it can detect and diagnose that activity which is occurring in their ecosystem and introduce a control to close the weakness. And in doing so, disrupt and deter the organized criminals who are targeting that particular opportunity. What that might mean is actually subjecting customers who are not being targeted by fraud to more friction for a very, very short period of time in order to protect them and stop them from potentially losing money. Um, that continuous trade-off is really, really important here because whilst that friction might be in place and the criminals are deterred, what organizations will do is create more advanced versions of that particular technology to make sure there is a much more targeted and seamless customer experience. I think if I put a Monzo spin on it, what we also really invest quite heavily in is proactive risk management. So, I guess what do I mean by that? That can range from developing customer self protection solutions. So, a good example of that is a service we call Monzo Calling. That basically means you can go into the app to actually check if you're on the phone with Monzo to reduce the risk of impersonation of scams where you receive a phone call out of the blue and somebody saying, "Hi, I'm calling from Monzo. We're from the fraud team. You need to move money from your account to a safe account." Actually being able to provide customers with those solutions empowers them, but it also moves fraud prevention right to the top of the funnel by giving customers tools to enable them to almost protect themselves at the same time that their bank is looking out for them and protecting them.
Yeah, because I think there is a responsibility that customers have to take themselves to protect
Yeah.
themselves, especially using, mobile apps and things. Um, Given that financial crime is increasingly enabled through social media and online retail platforms, how do you communicate the risks to them about, you know, these really real threats and how they can in everyday life protect themselves? Are there more steps that they need to take?
It's a great question, and I'd probably build on your question with a key data point, very much indexed in how I guess fraud originates or is enabled. In the UK, around 66% of authorised push payment fraud originated online in 2025. What that data point does is highlights the scale at which criminals are misusing social media platforms, online marketplaces, and search engines to enable fraudsters to reach people, to engage with people, and start that conversation, which would ultimately lead to an attempt of authorized push payment fraud. Now, in the UK, purchase scams really are the volume driver of APP fraud. So when I say purchase scams, and this is very much topical when we look ahead to the summer, which hopefully isn't too far away, we'll be going on holidays, we'll be buying tickets to sporting events and music festivals. Fraudsters very much see this as an opportunity, and we'll use technology to flood online platforms with content to engage them in conversation. A really, really simple example is we know the FIFA World Cup is due to start in the summer. The prices which those tickets are being sold at are extraordinarily high. For criminals, there's a massive opportunity here to be able to advertise those tickets at prices which are far too good to be true. So that point around customer responsibility is it's part customer, but it's also part bank. I see this as a collaboration because from my perspective, education is a key component of any good fraud strategy. So how can we provide customers with the right education in the moment? So by in the moment, I mean, let's say they've seen those tickets online and they're about to make a payment to that fraudster. That's what I mean by in the moment. So we have an opportunity there to provide them with education that actually this might be a potential scam, but actually you really change behavior outside of the moment. So when they're not at a point of making payment or they're not under pressure or under the spell of a fraudster. So how can you give them information which allows them to protect themselves?
Yeah.
Now, I do have sympathy with customers here because we don't expect every single customer to be a fraud expert. I would love that. I would hire them all tomorrow, but it's not the reality of life. So what we've seen, I think this has kind of grown through COVID is that actually a lot of customers have been desensitized to communications. So if you get that pop up in the app or you have an email from your bank or whatever it might be,
Yeah.
there's every chance you don't engage with that particular communication. So the key to education is actually providing it in a way or a medium which speaks to particular demographics of customers, and you can base that on user research, but also to be really specific, bespoke, and timely around those communications. So, for example, if you know based on data that I'm quite clearly, and you can't see my background right now, but it's full of football memorabilia, I'm clearly a football fan, that actually an educational message to me, which actually has a hook into sport and into football, means it's more likely I might read it and I might engage with it. And
Yeah.
that for me is the key to education is how can you build that level of trust first and foremost, but build that hook into actually why this is important for you to take a look at.
That's interesting because it's almost like they've got used to maybe getting a scam text or something, and you're actually trying to get a proper message through, and you're having to think about how will people now take note of that.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting. Let's talk about kind of maybe the influence of AI, towards the fraudster, but also in your defenses. What capabilities do you have to detect, these kind of fraudulent behaviors during onboarding? For example, with behavioral analytics, I don't know if you use that, liveness detection, biometrics. How are you using AI?
That's a great question, and you've already touched on a few of the real core components. So when we speak about AI from a financial services perspective, we've been using technology like machine learning models, which basically ingests a whole heap of different data sources, both internal data and external data and intelligence signals, to basically compute a risk score, which could lead then to an intervention for that particular customer based on a behavioral activity or a transactional activity. We've been using that for years and years and years and years. So we're really well versed in actually using that technology as essentially the shield to enable us to be able to protect our customers, but in a way which really targets what we deem to be potentially suspicious activity and preserving that seamless customer journey. So that's already been a big part of our makeup. All that's doing is expanding. So when we think about fraud, and a really, really good way of framing this is fraud in the UK is now the most commonly reported crime. That will be true in other areas of Europe, but we know the data isn't quite as mature yet in all different regions and jurisdictions. So fraud being the most reported crime in a particular country means that fundamentally this is happening every single day. This means that actually it's driven a whole heap of innovation in the space. And that's from banking, but that's also from different fraud vendors or fraud suppliers, a number of which will be at Identity Week as we get into June. It's really driven innovation around actually how can we really think collaboratively about going hard at the problem. What different signals do we want to use as part of that scorecard to identify in real time that this is a potential risk? And given how quickly fraud is evolving, that is a constant moving adversarial target. So that's the beauty of technology and machine learning models is you can retrain those models. So they're constantly learning in real time around how those signals or that sequence is evolving from a criminal's perspective to push up the signals which are important and pertinent to actually generate the right alerts to be assessed by fraud investigators. And this last part is really, really important because when I think about a really effective fraud detection and prevention strategy, it is a fusion of technology and humans. And when I say humans, I really mean our fantastic fraud investigators. And I'm not speaking for Monzo here, I'm speaking for the fraud community. We have a fantastic stable of highly experienced fraud investigators. And the ability of those investigators being able to review and investigate those alerts means that they will reach an outcome. That could be a true positive, i.e., we found a fraud versus a false positive. Actually, this wasn't a fraud, and then categorize and label those alerts in a way which continues to go back into the technology, back into the machine learning model. So
Yeah,
again, using those human inputs to continue to learn about what's happening in your ecosystem.
it's really interesting. Um, Lastly, does Monzo share data and these insights with third parties, technology partners, industry bodies, or other collaborators?
It's a great question. So I'll probably start by saying I don't think it's an over exaggeration to say that anyone in my position across industries will say that data and intelligence sharing is critical to actually materially reducing the prevalence of fraud on a global basis. From a Monzo perspective, and this is very much along with other banks in the UK, we very routinely share data and intelligence that's pertinent to the detection and ultimately prevention of fraud and financial crime. Um, Data sharing has been happening within financial services for decades. But as we've kind of touched on during the course of this conversation, fraud can originate outside of financial services, or very, very typically it originates outside of financial services. We've mentioned the online tech platforms, but also telecommunications providers. So the key move here is actually how do we share intelligence on a cross-sectoral basis to allow us to robustly disrupt what we know is organized criminality. In the UK, there's a really good example of how we're driving such efforts via a group called Stop Scams UK. That's essentially an industry-led collaborative membership designed to bring together the different sectors to help to stop scams at source. So financial services, the tech platforms, and also the telecommunications organizations. What we've seen from this collaboration is we've driven a whole range of different pilots, sharing different elements of data within our respective ecosystems. And what that's basically demonstrated is that if we share data, if we share the right data in real time, and that can be data from tech into banking or banking into tech or into telecommunications, it's super powerful in detecting fraudulent patterns and some fraudulent behaviors. The key now is how do we really successfully scale and sustain those kind of initiatives? That's going to be the real critical juncture in terms of how we think forward. I think the point I'll finish on is I think whilst the threat landscape is severe, there is, at least in my opinion, a real wave of momentum building. I was actually at the Global Fraud Summit it's last month actually, and it was really clear that fraud is becoming a key priority globally. That's not just for financial services, but for tech, for telecommunications, for governments. The power of an event like Identity Week is not only a fantastically informative and arranged agenda, but what it does, it really brings together the community of people who can make a difference. And that for me is really, really energizing. And I know this will sound and come across very cheesy, but we'll only make a lasting difference together as a collaborative and connected anti-fraud and financial crime community. And that, in all honesty, is why I'll be attending
Yeah.
Identity Week, but also why I'm really, really privileged to be able to speak about online fraud.
Absolutely. And forums like this, it is about the face-to-face interaction with other experts. And we look forward to seeing you there. It's going to come up very quickly, but hopefully it'll be a brilliant 2 days and worthwhile, definitely, for the financial services. There's so much around security, digital innovation, and customer experience. But thank you so much.
So welcome. Thank you.